Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage our next panel, Countering Disinformation's Threat to National Security, with former U.S. Representative from Texas, Will Hurd, U.S. Representative from Michigan, Elissa Slotkin, and moderated by Jeffrey Goldberg, Editor-in-Chief of The Atlantic.
Is this on? Now it is. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here, and thank you for sticking with us. We've had a good conference. I'm sorry that you didn't. I guess you have other things to do or something, but we've had a really good conference, and we're glad that you're here today. We're going to have try to have a fast-paced and very large conversation, not merely about disinformation in national security, but it's a great moment in the history of the planet to talk about foreign policy resetting. Vladimir Putin has reminded the world about certain immutable truths of human relations, and we need to fold that into what we talk about. And so I don't want to disaggregate disinformation from everything else that's going on. Obviously, it's everywhere, and it has impacts that we can see and not see, and so we'll get through it. But I thought, since we have both of you here, and in addition to having served in Congress and serving in Congress, both of these folks are veterans of the intelligence community professionals. It might be interesting to get you talking for just a minute or two about the Ukraine invasion, what it means for United States national security, what it means for Russian and American reputations around the world in crucial parts of the world, and obviously fold in your analysis of disinformation and its role in everything that's happened to date. But maybe we start with you, Congressman Slotkin, just to talk about maybe start with what surprised you the most about the events of the last month and a half, and where you think this puts America vis-a-vis Russia and vis-a-vis Europe.
Sure. Thanks for having me. Glad to be here with my friend Will Hurd, who I served with for one term. So I think, particularly related to the events of this conference, what was super interesting to start off with about this invasion of Ukraine was what the administration did to try and forestall it, right? To try and stop it. The release of very large amounts of classified information, declassifying it, and trying to expose the Russian misinformation and disinformation was more aggressive than I had seen before. And as a CIA officer, you're certainly taught, do not declassify information.
But freaked out. Did it freak you guys out at all that they were just pumping this stuff out? Sources and methods and possible compromise?
Certainly I wondered if we were blowing sources as we were releasing the information, but I thought it was an interesting approach to try and counter the Russian narratives that Ukraine was a threat to them, that it was an existential issue for them, and that it was done for these pure and reasonable reasons. And I think they tried. It didn't work, but they tried. And I think my guess is that's one of the first times in history that we've really had a campaign of releasing classified information or declassified information like that. I think what has surprised me, or what I've noticed since the invasion, is that a whole new generation of people who didn't grow up as Cold War kids, as I did, I'm 45, anyone my age or older grew up kind of thinking about nuclear possibilities with Russia. A whole new generation is realizing that there are still really nasty leaders out there who do terrible things. And I think that's reset the conversation for a lot of people who maybe had strong feelings about American foreign policy, but certainly are now seeing that it's not like other actors don't take it 10 steps further. And I think I represent Michigan State, and that's been an interesting conversation to have as they're watching a war unfold on social media.
Right.
So I think the most surprising thing for me is the need to rethink a lot of assumptions that we have made about ourselves, about our allies, and about our adversaries. This notion, everybody thought that the Ukrainians weren't going to be able to hold their own. wait a minute, in 2014, they actually pushed the Russians out away from Kyiv when they were not as prepared. What is Vladimir Putin actually willing to do? What is the Western alliance willing to do when it comes like that? There's actually a level of cohesiveness that many of us didn't expect was there. And so I think that is the question. On the intelligence sharing and information, I would say it was an attempt to engage in the information space, which is a positive thing. But if you're sharing, and I was less concerned about the kind of information that was being shared because it was about about movements on a battlefield, about things that are about to happen. I don't think many of that stuff revealed some of the more secret and the more nuanced sources and methods that we have. It was equivalent of making public things that we have shared with our allies in other phases. And that's not to just diminish what had happened, but we have to engage in that information space. The ability of the Russians, and I've talked about this during my entire career, to push a narrative. The fact that we're actually talking about Nazis still is mind-boggling to me. And the fact that is a narrative in a lot of conservative circles is quite shocking to me. But we also have to think what the Chinese are trying to do to weaponize what's happening now. They keep talking about the 140 countries that are part of the UN that are not participating in these sanctions with Russia. That's not disinformation. That's a fact. But what does that actually mean? And we have to start countering that narrative as well too.
It's something slightly more subtle than disinformation. It's ordering a set of facts in such a way as to
100%.
make a plausible but actually completely irrelevant point.
But the information space is a domain that we have to fight in. Public diplomacy is a domain. It's something we need to get better at. And something that we have used successful in previous conflicts. All stuff's connected.
I guess I want to level set a little bit and talk about your definitions of disinformation, but let me just stay on that for 1 second because it's interesting. Do you think that we should, both of you, do you both think that we should fight disinformation with disinformation? In other words, to put it bluntly, screw with Russia the way they screw with us?
No.
Why not?
And look, why not? Because your values, your actions need to be based on your values. And if you value freedom, if you value transparency, if you value authority, then you can't deviate from that. And guess what? It's easier to lie. Some version of this quote has been around for like 2,000 years. A lie travels faster than the truth. The lie gets somewhere before the truth can put its pants on, right? Whatever that quote is. That's been around for a really long time. But we have to be disciplined and stick to our values, and the rest of the world has to see that we are look, this is actually a chapter in my book. Your audio and your video have to match. The things you say and the things you do have to match the things you say.
And I would say, when a democracy attempts to use false information, even if it's for a good cause, it ends up boomeranging on you, and it undercuts the very thing you're trying to promote. I do think, though, and we have a long history in the United States, particularly during the Cold War, of kind of the version of what China does, highlighting the facts that we think are really important, right? Think about all the radio stations and the newspapers and the things that we placed and paid for during the Cold War in order to tell the story that we wanted to tell about democracy and America. I don't have a problem with that, and I think if you talk to folks who are immigrants from Eastern Europe, they'll say that was a critical lifeline for them to understand something different than what they were being told by their dictator or by the Communist Party. So I don't have a problem with that, but it has to be factual. And I think where democracies get into real trouble is when in the cause of freedom, they tell a bunch of lies, it just boomerangs on them, and you lose the faith of the people you're trying to message.
Right, and we've let those muscles atrophy a little bit over the past 30 years, especially. We come back to that, but staying on this question of what authoritarian countries do. Maybe you can both share with us who you think are the major threats in the disinformation space, and rank order them, and where you put China and its level of sophistication, Russia, Iran. Give us the. Let's imagine you're still working in Langley, and somebody asks you, like, where are the main disinformation nodes that we have to combat and be aware of? How do you do those definitions? Either one of you.
I mean, I think it's interesting. I think Russia, while they're often ham-handed at what they do, they certainly use it as a major tool in their toolkit. They are, and they're getting better, right? We saw them interfere in our election in 2016, and when we actually dug into it, you know, what did they actually do? It was some pretty ham-handed stuff, but that's just an opportunity for them to learn and grow. I think China has capability, but doesn't explore as much in that space, but they are the long game in my mind on the issue of disinformation and misinformation. Like, Russia's the short-term tactical problem right in front of us, but the long game is 100%, I think, the Chinese. And then there are other actors who may try. We've seen some stuff from Iran, we've seen some stuff from North Korea, but it's largely small ball stuff. China, to me, is where the real game is.
Like, I completely agree. I second everything the distinguished woman from the great state of Michigan has just said.
Just practicing for your next your return.
So capabilities and willingness to use those capabilities. Yep. China has greater capabilities, but they are less willing to use those capabilities than what the Russians are. What do the Russians have to lose? The Russians have perfected tactics, techniques, and procedures over the last 40 years on how to weaponize information. So they're really good at it, but at times super ham-handed. We have to assume. I'm on the board of a company that just released a tool this week that you can Google, or you put in text to say, create an impressionist image of the Mona Lisa as painted by watercolor. 2 seconds later, you get 40 images. What the heck? Like, it's crazy, right? And it looks good. So imagine the Chinese have this tool. We limit the use of this for faces and for individuals to try to prevent deepfakes. But imagine some of the tools and the tactics that the Russians are using now, and you have this powered by technology and being able to use deepfakes. How is that going to impact our society? We also have to look at what is, like, the thing that has been fascinating to me through all of this with Ukraine. Russia in Latin America. RT Latin America in Spanish has greater reach than RT itself did at its height. What the narratives that the Russians are pushing in our own Western Hemisphere is not being countered, and it's growing at a huge rate. We wonder why many Latin, Central and South American countries aren't as active in our efforts to prevent the Russians from getting out of Ukraine. So the Russians are using these tools now. They are the folks that we have to be focused on, but the long-term fight is absolutely the Chinese government.
And so I think what's interesting, let's take RT as a perfect example, right? So you could be driving between Chicago and Detroit, stop overnight at a Howard Johnson's in Indiana, and watch RT 6 weeks ago. It was part of many, many cable packages. And that, in my mind, is just a propaganda arm of the Russian government. It's paid for by the Russian government, like meets the standard definition, but you could go watch it at a Howard Johnson. We tried, when the Mueller report came out, there was a group of us who really dug in, like, how do we get at RT? How do we prevent them from being on the airwaves?
You don't see this as a free speech issue?
No, not when it's paid for by a foreign government. If that same content was being produced by an American company, we've got a whole First Amendment, Second Amendment, problem there, First Amendment problem. Sorry, not Second Amendment.
Eventually, you might have a Second Amendment problem.
We want no Second Amendment problems. But because it was paid for by the Russians, that was the hook, right, for us to try and do something. We looked, we tried, we had all kinds of exploration into this on a bipartisan basis, and couldn't manage what the private cable companies in the United States did in 1 week after the invasion. The Russians go into Ukraine, and all these private cable companies decided, you know what, I'm not going to be responsible for peddling this stuff, and they cut them off. And now you can't see that RT on Howard Johnson's, on the TV. So I think the other super interesting thing about what's going on between Russia and Ukraine is the role of the private sector and how that's affecting national security, right? When Visa and PayPal and McDonald's willingly, without any guidance or push from the White House, shut down operations in Russia, that has more daily effect on the lives of a Russian citizen than probably at this point anything we're doing in sanctions. So I think that is just it's an aside that the private sector is in this space with us, and I think has a growing role in playing a part in national security.
Right.
For us.
And look, I'm glad all those companies did that, right? But here's what's happened. Those same reporters that were on RT that were tweeting with an RT handle are now in other places, at other, where the First Amendment issue becomes a challenge because it is at a U.S. American.
Are you advocating doing something about them?
No, I'm saying it makes this problem even more difficult because the folks metastasized. Now you can say, hey, focus on this one place, RT, what they're doing at RT. Now they're at different places, and do you always know that this was a former reporter at RT that's still pushing some of the same narratives that they have, which makes this fight even more difficult. But guess what? We got to keep doing it. What I find another thing that was valuable and interesting in all this, when this first, I'm pretty aggressive with what I think the United States of America should be doing to help our Ukrainian brothers and sisters. And when I came out really early on, my former staff reached out to me and they're like, boss, man, you're a little aggressive, right?
Did you say, and you're a little former?
Yeah, no, look, they're looking out for me. They're like, hey, this is not where the public is. But guess what? When reporters started sending back the images and showing what's happening, you have seen a change in public opinion in the United States about how bad what is happening in Ukraine. And so it's an opportunity. We talk about all the negative things that are hard around this, but public opinion swung pretty quickly when you showed the truth, right? And did it in a way that hit people in the face. And so there have been some positives of changing and influencing public opinion in the right direction.
And actually, that's a perfect example of, I think Americans are very empathetic. They do see these images, especially young people, where they can see someone their age, 13 years old in a bunker with their dog doing a TikTok on what it's like to live underground. I think it affects us in a way that I'm proud of, right? I'm glad that we feel empathy. But on the other side, there's so many conflicts around the world, right, that don't get exposure. You can't get a camera in. I was mentioning to you beforehand an incident that happened when I was speaking to a class and a Uyghur student stood up. And she's like, my brother's been detained for 4 years. I'm watching the entire world feel sympathy for the Ukrainians. How come I can't get this for the Uyghurs? And we started talking about it, and part of it is you don't have that footage, that camera inside those detention centers that are focusing on the plight of the Uyghurs. So information is still very much a weapon and a way to get Americans rallied around a
We'll
cause.
talk about that, because I do want to hear what you think some of the solutions are, obviously. And we talked about sort of the withering of American, I don't want to call it propaganda, but state-supported but transparent journalism efforts to tell people what the world looks like from the American perspective. Is there more that the United States government, Congress, should be doing for blasting out information at Chinese and Asian audiences about what's actually happening in Xinjiang? How much? Talk about some of the solutions. Countering disinformation with information seems like where you're both going, but how much can we do, and how effective would it be?
Yeah, I think that's part of it. Countering it with information is part of it, and that's why, I mean, we still have things that are basically the son of, you know, Radio Free Europe. We still have these arms that put out information about what's going on in the world that's different than what you can get in the local, you know, whatever country you're in. But I do think that there's some cleanup that has to be done around regulating particularly foreign media in the United States, right? To me, it was crazy that I couldn't say RT is an arm of the Russian government. They're paid for by the Russians. That should be shut down by the FEC, right? That's where is the play there? And it's because we stopped making kind of laws around propaganda when the Cold War started to ebb. I mean, years before, actually. So I think there's a lot of cleanup we can do, and not just for TV. We were talking about newsprint, digital. You know, Facebook made a decision after 2016 that, whoops, it's probably not a good idea if foreign governments get to buy ad space on Facebook. And they didn't, no one forced them to do that. They just got embarrassed enough that they did it. But I think it would be useful to have some laws around not being able to buy airtime and ad time as a foreign entity. I think that's a basic place.
Sounds like
to
a
start.
slippery slope, though, no?
Look, I think the real answer, this is a good CIA answer, it depends, right? And
That's why you guys always got paid the moderate bucks, right?
Real moderate.
yeah. So look, when you're talking about disinformation on its own, you have actors' behaviors and you have the content. There are certain actors that are easier to deal with because when they're foreign. Like disinformation by foreign actors is a much easier issue to deal with, as we've already discussed. You can talk about the behaviors that they're using, the tools, the tactics that they're using. The platforms can figure that out, identify this. After the 2016 election, I think the Senate report on what happened, went into some good examples. There's a number of entities that have shown how these tools are being used. Can you tweak or make sure you're identifying when those tools are being used in methods that we know bad actors are using? We can address that. Is Twitter and Facebook content providers? And yes, like this is not a hard question, right? And I think knowing what we know now, we wouldn't have had a carve out for them when this was first started and say you're just like newspapers, you're just like TV, you're just like a print. Is there the political will to do that or change that? I don't know what the answer is. But you can only the way you fight an information war is with actual deeds. The longer if we use Ukraine as the example, the longer this conflict goes on, the more pressure you're going to see our Eastern European partners be under, because they have populations that are living under the threat of war. They have, the closer you are to Russia, the more impact sanctions are to you, and you're dealing with a humanitarian crisis that's growing. Those governments are going to feel pressure from that. The populations are going to get frustrated because they feel like they're being drowned out. Then you're going to see the Russians say, hey, the reason you're having problems in Poland is because of these Ukrainians. And so what are we doing now to get ahead of that issue? Like, why? Everybody wants to use a Marshall Plan for everything, right? But this is where an actual Marshall Plan modeled on the previous Marshall Plan to talk about the rebuilding of Ukraine can start now. And you do it in Slovenia, you do it in Poland, you do it in Moldova, so that you start helping to support those governments who are dealing with the aftermath of this, so that we get ahead of this narrative that's going to be pushed the longer this war goes. Because ultimately, what is Vladimir Putin trying to do? Two things: stay in power until he dies, reestablish the territorial integrity of the USSR, and they're doing that by. And how do you prevent? How do you do that? Make sure NATO isn't as strong. So if you increase some of those friction points, you're going to see that Western alliance.
But let me just come back and push against a point you both made before. This is old as the Bible. By way of deception, you shall do war, right? America has a long history, like many other countries, of using deceptive methods to convince enemies that we're stronger than they are, that we're here when we're actually there, and so on. So what is the problem of an American company making a deepfake video of a Russian general saying whatever they're putting in his mouth that might cause morale to ebb with his soldiers in Ukraine? Beats the hell out of droning him to death. I mean, that's certainly killing people is more severe than making fake videos about them. So why would you be so hesitant to use deceptive methods?
Real simple, because that's going to get back into the American population, right? And so when you look at blowback, in 9.5 years I was involved. I may or may not have been involved in some covert action, okay? And one of the things you always evaluate is what is the potential blowback within American society in English language print. Doing something like that in this interconnected world where bits can move so fast, the fact that something like that would get back, and you should not be doing anything to your own population to mislead them or tell them wrong. That's why you shouldn't do it.
And there's a big difference between like creating, the only options are not creating a deep fake or, as you say, droning someone to death, right? I mean, there's stuff in the middle.
You don't like my verb, my verbization?
I don't love the verb. But I think the truth is, if you want to affect the morale of the Russian soldiers, especially the conscripts who are on the ground right now in Ukraine, you don't need a deep fake of Vladimir Putin. You just need to show them what's actually happening on the battlefield. The fact that they can't get food, water, and fuel more than 180 miles from their border. So I would rather, I'm with Will. I think that if you start, if the American public said, oh Lord, our own government is making deep fakes of someone else, what's to keep them from doing a deep fake of Joe Biden or somebody else that they like or don't like? To me, it just undermines trust, and we're already in a tough place.
Yeah, no, I mean, I actually agree with you, but I mean, I'm wondering if the horse is already out of the barn on that question.
We have to adhere to our values. Why was everybody criticizing President Biden about the in comment in his speech? Most people were criticizing him because that is going to be weaponized and used within Russian society to confirm their suspicions that, America is trying to tell you who your leader should be, right? No Russian, even if they dislike Vladimir Putin, wants to be told who their leader is, right? And so if you do something like that on purpose with the intention to change, it's going to have a negative effect, and it's not.
There's something that I don't understand. We've talked about this before. There's something I don't understand. There's an interesting analog between this, let's use this deep fake question, and all of the other challenges we're facing in the future of warfare: augmented soldiers, augmented humans, transhumanism, and all of the threats. And we know, I mean, this is not a subject of this conference, but we know that when China develops the technological capability to augment born-style soldiers, they're not going to sit around and have long colloquies about the morals and ethics and the doubts and the shades of gray. Authoritarian governments tend to just do the thing that's most effective for their immediate goals. So then our Pentagon, our defense establishment, has the same challenge. Like, the Chinese now have augmented soldiers, and we don't. So, and then we're going to have this conversation. This comes back to something that you were telling me, which is that we're always on the back foot, a democracy, when it's fighting an authoritarian government. So my question is, how do you even out? And I understand we have ideals, and the moral arc of the universe is long and it bends toward justice, but sometimes it doesn't. How do you actually create a level playing field when one party will use disinformation and one party just won't?
An authoritarian government can get someplace first, right? There's no question about that. I'm not going to question that premise. But an idea is always more powerful, and so we have to be prepared for that eventuality. Let's start having those debates now. Let's not wait until that thing happens, and after it happens, wring our hands and be like, oh my God, what are we going to do, right? Let's start having some of these debates now and say, hey, and base it on what is our value and why do we think this is important, because that is what is going to have a longer shelf life than any individual or any tactic that people are potentially using.
And I think the decision space for an authoritarian government, as Will said, is just super short, right? I mean, by the time the Chinese just decide we're going to invest in this new technology for our military, that decision space is about 3 years for the Pentagon. And right now, that doesn't mean it should stay 3 years, it should shorten, but it's 3 years.
And how long is the Chinese decision space?
Less than a year. From like, we have an idea, we want to invest in a new technology, we want to move, we want to go.
The chairman says do it, and do it.
Right, as opposed to us where we, and we have Congress has all kinds of rules, and they have to think about investments differently, and just there's a whole different structure to making decisions that makes them faster in pretty much every scenario. But the only way, it's not like they have augmented soldiers, so we have to get augmented soldiers. There is a way of saying that we're going to hold true to our values, but invest and double down in other things that help us compete in that fight. And I think that's what democracies aren't doing as well as we could, right? We're not like, we're saying, oh shoot, we don't want to compromise our values, so we're not going to do what this other government is doing. Well, no, then you need to find 5 other ways to kick their ass in different places. Yeah. And I think that's what I regret, is that there's some holding back and fear. And look, it's the same thing if you've got, if you're a politician and you're running against someone who just makes things up. The answer is not to just start making things up. The answer is to start beating them at different games and bring the battlefield back to reality.
And don't be afraid to use the power you do have, right? That is some of my concerns right now. Well, if we do this is going to escalate. They're going to escalate anyways. So if we're not using our soft power, if we're not using our hard power in a way to prevent, and back to first principle, prevent the massacre of innocent lives. We can do that. And so don't be afraid to use the tools and the power that you currently have.
Right. This is an interesting segue to a question about disinformation about America at home. And I think both of you think about these questions. You're a national security Republican, you're a national security Democrat. Your party obviously has a rather large crazy town faction. Adam Kinzinger was here to describe that a little while ago. Your party is not without people, obviously, who believe that America plays a malign role in the world. We've seen a lot of that discussion over the last couple of years. Talk about the Russian invasion of Ukraine in the context of how Americans understand themselves. And I ask this question for a very specific reason. It's very, very hard to convince the vast global audience that the American way of life is superior to the Russian Putinist way of life if Americans themselves don't believe it. And I'm wondering, it's a little bit of an RT question in a kind of way. Have we and our population suffered from disinformation about America's role in the world over the last 20 years?
Yes. Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt, but yes, we've suffered from it, right? Because many of us that care about these things or are involved in this have failed to articulate why these things matter. We have failed to articulate what should America's role in the rest of the world be. I'm of the opinion we should not have gotten out of Afghanistan. I had that debate here at the Institute of Politics a number of months ago, and because for the last 15 years, we have failed to articulate why it matters to people back home. I always say, why would my brother care about this stuff? And so it is connecting. Foreign policy is not foreign. And we have both, and again, the political spectrum is no longer a line, it's a horseshoe. The edges are closer to each other than they are to the middle. Both parties want to articulate to the extremist edges more than they are talking about the normal. What we've had to do over our careers is a lot harder than many of our lazy colleagues who just go in, my words, not hers.
They're mine too.
So we have to make that case. And we failed. Now, Ukraine is slightly different because the images that we're seeing, it's very clear to people that's wrong. They may not know what led to this, but what's happening there is wrong. So we have those images. Also, people that are worried about the price of gas at the pump or food, they recognize that the Russian invasion of Ukraine is impacting that. So people are starting to think, okay, some of these things are connected, but we have to make the case. When George Washington said, "Don't have intermingling alliances," whatever the word was used, my man George Washington was right at the time. But things are very different now. and the talking about how NATO, these debates about NATO back in 2016 about whether that was effective or not. Many of the conversations of how things like NAFTA wasn't helpful and important to our society. We have to make the case why 70 years of peace and prosperity in Europe was good for us because it helped us increase our quality of life. It helped us uplift humanity. And if that erodes, our position in the world is going to erode, which means our retirement is going to be less. The ability for our kids and our grandkids to get access to good paying jobs is going to be impacted. We have to make that case every single time. It's hard, and it's hard to fit that into 208 characters.
I'm going to come to you. I just want to follow up with something about you and the party. My question for you is that wing of the party that is objectively pro-Putinist right now, are they victims of Russian disinformation, or do they just come to this all by themselves? And I'm talking about the people who kind of semi-drove you out of the party.
No, for sure. So there's only two options. They are witting or unwitting, right? And to be honest,
useful idiots or just useful non-idiots?
And because they think, so if you're witting, it's because you think there is a political expedience to doing that thing. Mm-hmm. If you're unwitting, it's because you're a moron. And so I don't know what's worse. If I'm being honest, how do you?
So Tucker Carlson, moron or utilitarian player?
Look, if you're being quoted and being reused, and clips are being used back in Moscow to make the case for Vladimir Putin, you're doing something wrong, and you need to rethink what you're doing.
Here. I would just say, just on Will's point, because I think it's interesting for people who are interested in public policy and journalism now, like coming up now, that we were both CIA officers. You're squirreled away. You're doing your thing. You're protecting the country. You're working on the issue that you've been assigned to work on, and you don't have to think about how the American public views your job. That's not your job to think about it. Then we both became members of Congress, which is the opposite, right? It's all, your bosses are the people who elect you. So it's all about what people think of you and think of what you're proposing. And the biggest lesson I've learned as a national security policy person who went into elected office is that it is no longer okay for a bunch of people of either party to just decide foreign policy and not bring the American public along with them. We're done with that era. Afghanistan and Iraq killed that era because the average person in my district knows exactly the price that we paid for Iraq and Afghanistan, if not in dollars, in the blood of the people who went into the military. So there is no longer that luxury of a bunch of people, Democrats and Republicans getting elected and sitting in Washington and deciding our role in the world. We need to have that conversation. I think that's what Will is getting at, is bringing people along. And we don't have a lot of great communicators on that. And it's true, after these 2 long wars and 20 years of all the blood and treasure spent, I don't blame the average college student who looks at the United States and says, why do we think we're so great, right? We don't necessarily, kick butt when we go abroad, and why do we have this such high and mighty approach? And I think what Russia is doing is reminding the average person that we are not perfect abroad, we are not always successful abroad, but man, we're better than that actor leading the world.
We're going to go to questions in 1 minute, but one last question from me for the two of you. If there's one thing that you could do to, while adhering to your values, counter Russian, Chinese disinformation globally, what would that be? A piece of legislation, a funding mechanism? What would the thing be? A technological fix?
I've been exposed to a company that is able to determine whether social media users are fake. Have that be pretty broadly exposed, right? So that you know clearly that this thing that you're working, that you're interacting with is fake on any of the systems. I think that would go a long way in changing the narrative.
I think disclosure is important, but I think there's just a higher level of digital literacy that we need in this country. And I know a lot of people who, even if they saw a label at the bottom, would still hit forward and send to people. And so to me, it is about education and just starting to figure out a way to educate from K through 12 on how to be more savvy digital users, because it's not going to stop. It's going to come from 100 different places, and even when people are going to be exposed to the originator of the stuff, they're still going to push it if they don't know what they're part of when they're doing that.
Yeah, right over there. Thank you. And please keep your questions short and in the form of a question. That'd be great.
My name is Kelsey, and I work for a tech startup called Logically that uses AI to identify disinformation online. And something I'm really curious about, based on the last question actually, is kind of the role that Congressman Hurd mentioned of kind of companies playing in this space, and then the role of education and of media literacy, civic literacy. And I'm also curious what your thoughts as legislators are on the now congressionally mandated Foreign Malign Influence Center, the creation of that center at ODNI. And is that an answer? And is that something that can bring together civil society, the domestic institutions, our foreign policy apparatus to kind of have a more holistic approach to countering malign influence?
I'll start with the last part first and then let Will do the private sector piece. So I am the chairwoman of the subcommittee on intelligence and counterterrorism on the Homeland Security Committee. And one of the things that we started looking at right after January 6th was domestic terrorism and how to deal with malign influence in our own country. And to say that it's a minefield is an understatement, right? Because of freedom of speech issues, because of people's concern on both the right and the left about the government dictating what they can look at and what they can read and what they can have access to. So that center was the best we could get to try and tackle this. And in a perfect world, it would be this open center where we could have that dialogue. But the minute you start having the government as a seat at the table, you start getting everybody like on their, their hackles go up. And so we've actually been able to do precious little to deal with the spread of disinformation and misinformation, even threatening activities and threatening speech online when the originator is an American and when they're influencing American viewers or American clickers or whatever. So that was as good as we could get, but still imperfect. And I think one of the things that the left and the right really unite around is that they don't want Washington deciding who's a good actor and who's a bad actor. And on the left, they'll say, like, look, right now, Democrats are in power, so I'm probably fine with whoever they'd go after, but I don't want it, if President Trump came back, I don't want them coming after black and brown people and, who are activists online. So it gets really complicated really fast. And I think actually outside of government is where we can do the most open thinking about this and then bring it as ideas to the government rather than having us be the lead actor in all of this.
I'll just add on the tech piece. Technology companies have to recognize that they have a public policy function as well, and they have a public policy responsibility. And so when you're developing these tools, you have to think about that your constituent is not just your investors or your customers, it's also the broader community that are being impacted by your tool.
There was a question right here.
Congresswoman Slotkin, you spoke about how China is really the long game for foreign policy. And Congressman Hurd, you've also passed legislation on AI. AI is commonly viewed as the current arms race. How competitive do you see our country being in that arms race? And what can we do to become the global leader in AI, given, I think as we've all learned, who controls these technologies does really matter in terms of how they end up being used?
I'll start, but I'm sure Will has something he wants to say on this. So I think that it comes down to the problem we were highlighting before of how different it is to be a democracy trying to figure out how to incorporate that technology and then if you're a dictatorship or the Communist Party and you can just make unilateral decisions. I think that while I would put money any day of the week on American entrepreneurs to come up with the tech behind all this innovation, I think the decision space in incorporating it, especially in the government, is going to be slower than the startups. I mean, some of these startups as good patriotic Americans, would want to actually sell this to the government and have the government help, use it for good purposes. But there's a whole problem where the government cannot move fast enough and a startup dies on the vine before it can get that contract. So I have no doubt that we can do the intellectual capital, but because it's so new, and because we're a democracy, there's going to be a slowness to incorporating it. That's just a reality, unfortunately.
I just wrote a book about this topic, to be honest, and the whole point is, I thought I understood technology when I was in Congress. Being out a year working with some amazing technology companies, I realized how little I actually knew, and that these technologies are moving even faster. Best case scenario, we're tied with China. That's the best case scenario. And when Vladimir Putin, we've all heard this statement, whoever masters AI is going to master the world. When you have a country that doesn't care about civil liberties, you're always going to have more data. With more data, you're going to be able to train algorithms faster. Giving all that information to other authoritarian government is going to speed up this process. And this is why we can't look at this as the US alone. We have to be working with our allies, especially Europe, and we have to get beyond this transatlantic beef on what privacy is. Europe and America views privacy closer to each other than Europe and China does. And so my fear is, I've seen what American companies can do today. My fear is if the Chinese government has this, they're going to be able to get and why does this matter? Whoever has the first mover advantage of getting to close to artificial general intelligence. That first mover advantage is going to be so significant that you're never going to be able to catch up, and you don't want to be second place.
Mm-hmm. I think there's a question back there. I can't see that well, but oh, okay, right here, and then maybe one more if we can. Mm-hmm.
Hi, my name is Evelina. I'm a graduate student at the Harris School of Public Policy. Congresswoman, you said that information is necessary to be able to spread, on-the-ground information is necessary to be able to spread awareness. I am from Armenia, and half of my family lives in Karabakh. Mm-hmm. When Azerbaijan attacked Karabakh in 2020, there were independent journalists on the ground, and the information was out there. But it seems like in the United States, there's a little bit of pick and choose as to whose humanity matters when we're amplifying their voices. Whether it's in Congress or the tech platforms or just the average citizen, does the US have a moral responsibility to amplify everyone's voice around the world, and whose voice really matters? Or is it more of a, how does it impact us? What's in it for us? And that's when we decide to amplify those voices.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I've had actually a version of this question asked not only by the Uyghur student who I met, but folks who are advocating on behalf of people in Yemen, right? There's all kinds of conflicts around the world that have been going on and are terrible and haven't gotten a fraction of the airtime that Ukraine has, right? I think it's a couple things. First of all, I do think we have a responsibility both in the executive branch and in Congress to highlight and flag these crises that are going on around the world. So whether it's Myanmar or Kashmir or places that aren't on the tip of the tongue of the average American, but are getting dealt with in the House Foreign Affairs Committee, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. I do think we have a responsibility to highlight those. But it's kind of like, I hate to say this, it's kind of like the social media space and how one clip goes viral and one doesn't. It's like there's some sort of combination of things that take a conflict and make it a source of widespread interest. And I think for Ukraine, we can't overlook the fact that it's Russia. And anyone who's my age or older, like, it's a familiar enemy. It's a familiar bad guy, like Rocky IV. Like, it's, it is us versus them. And that feels more simple than our Nagorno-Karabakh, right? That for the average American, maybe their parents now and grandparents really understood this conflict, but they don't understand that conflict, and they don't understand Yemen. Also, we like good versus evil, right? We like when there's a bad guy and a good guy, and with the Russia-Ukraine crisis, it is hard to say, well, there are great people on both sides, right? Russia invaded under false pretenses. So
Noting that it is still said, by the way.
Okay.
Yeah.
fine,
Alas.
you're
Yeah.
right. So people
Yeah.
but the average American understands that there's sort of a good and an evil in this case. And I think when they don't understand a conflict, when it's hard to present in quick little sound bites, you don't grab that attention. It's not to say it's fair. And Lord knows the people in Yemen and other places do not feel like they're getting the attention that they deserve from the American public. But I think that's part of what makes one crisis amplify and others sit and fester.
I'll give Will the last word, but let me just follow that, because there's what's unspoken so far is that it's white.
Yeah,
That
too.
I mean, how much of that is just
That's
that these are white people and we're seeing white people suffer, and it just scans differently than what's going on in Ethiopia right now.
And many Ukrainians are more middle class, right? So they have the ability to put a TikTok video on with them and their dog and their like fleece jacket on top, and it looks like more of what many Americans associate with themselves. So I definitely think that that's part of it.
Part of the question is also, is there anything that the government can do to raise awareness of, you can't make people read things that they don't want to read, but is there something that you can do to bring attention to Yemen?
Yes, look, Congress has 3 powers. We have the power to appropriate money, we have the power to legislate, and the one that often is missed, the power to convene and amplify, right? Having a hearing, like I went to the hearing, I'm not on the Foreign Affairs Committee, but I went to the hearing on Kashmir because I have such a large Pakistani-American population in my district that was really focused on this issue. Having a hearing and amplifying that and then getting the press there, that's part of what we can do. But I can't make, my cousin in Michigan like start spreading that all over her TikTok because it's not grabbing her. And I think that's just a reality. It's unfair. It's deeply unfair, but it is a reality.
Last word to you.
Since the 40s, we've been saying never again. But shit happens all the time. And there was things that have been within our power to prevent. And America has become an exceptional nation, not because of what we have taken, but because of what we have given. And we have to make the cases, even when it's unpopular, even when people don't understand it, of why that matters to us and our way of life and how this ultimately impacts us. And when we do that, when America's operating that way, we're at our best. And we have to get beyond this notion about only caring about ourselves because the world is interconnected and it's our responsibility. Some people have the ability to carry heavier loads than others. That's why JFK said we were the standard bearers and the watchmen to the walls of world freedom. And that's our responsibility. We can't shy away from it.
Will Hurd, Elissa Slotkin, thank you very, very much. Thank you, everyone.